very short time this afternoon. Thank you for welcoming me and having me come. It's a real pleasure. I speak to many different audiences in the last 4 or 5 years since I started this 1,000 China supplier study. For another time, I'll tell you all about my story, how I got going, but today with a short time, I could spend a day on each of these squares, starting from the macro issues, supplier then buyer. But I want to focus a bit more on, okay, what do I learn from this China supplier study that may be relevant to the quality and costs? So I think there are 2 areas we want to look at here. What's in the mind of the supplier? And number 2, what are the big buyers doing? Now, there's probably a few big buyers represented in this group today, but I want to share with you some of the things I learned from my interviews and my visits to HTC, Apple, Motorola, and some of these other big buyers, and how they actually manage their suppliers. So and that may come up in question time if you have questions of that. So just give you some background. Here's what is different, how I'm different from other professors, is I like to go into the field here. And so we have 2 factories here, and all of you have seen these factories before, I'm sure. The one on the right here is automated, this one's not automated. And I know this is very low technology, it's textiles, but this is in Dongguan, you all know where it is. And what was really interesting was this factory here is outsourcing, and this factory is not outsourcing. And I always tell buyers that you all know this deal now is you don't know what's going on until you actually go and see the factory. And so I show these videos because this is what I love to do, actually go into the factory and actually find out what's going on and look for contrasts, look for differences. What are some factories doing well? What are some factories doing not so well? And that was my initial ideas that I had about 4 or 5 years ago. Then after I thought, no, I've got to do something bigger than that. Let's go and interview 1,000 suppliers and really find out what's going on. Now, rather than just interview 1,000 suppliers in all different industries, I said, okay, I really had an interest in the consumer electronics, so I will go to and interview component suppliers. And these were component suppliers and transistors, the very low generic components, some plastics, basic metals, all the way to the high-end ICs, TFT modules and things like that. So the whole range I ended up interviewing over a 2-year period. So let's just keep moving on this, because here are some of the takeaways from this afternoon. And I guess the mind of the supplier, there's 4 different types of suppliers that I've witnessed in my 1,000 interviews. And I want to show you some frameworks that you can take away. So you've got 1,000 stories, I've got 1,000 stories, but I think the thing we need to do is frame these stories and put it together. And then at the end, I'll just talk 1 or 2 items about some of the best supply management practices I've seen among buyers or some of the leaders in the electronics industry and what they do. And I've already mentioned some of those in the early beginning. If I had more time, I'd tell you more about China, and this is a talk for another time. So we'll just keep moving on this. I'm going to flick through a few PowerPoint slides, so please forgive me. You know, labour costs are going up, and you know where that is. That's looking over the hiking hills of Hong Kong from Yanshan in Shenzhen. Right, so what's in the mind of the supplier? Well, I went out and I wanted to interview 25, more than 25 trade expos, 1,075 interviews. I had 55 interviewers. I actually personally met every one of these suppliers that were interviewed because I screened them. I said, okay, yes, interview this person. No, don't interview that person. So while I didn't actually interview them all myself, I actually screened every interviewee. And I trained every interviewer to do those interviews. A lot of my colleagues, professors, they'll pay a third party to go out and do the interviews. You don't know who's being interviewed. You don't know about the data. That's why I don't really trust academic surveys, and I don't always trust consulting surveys. I wanted to actually shift the benchmark for what is good research. That is research that speaks to academia, but also speaks to industry. And so I think I'm on the road to doing that. Here's the big framework that came out first. Many of you see this. When you see a supplier, they're actually down here. For because they're under pressure to manage down costs. They're under foreign entrant pressure. Why? Because foreign entrants actually bring better deals for employees to work out, more alternatives for their employees to go and work for, okay? They actually bid up all the costs of labour in your industry. Or then there's competition from foreign customers, and they are putting pressure in terms of margins, monitoring and contracts. So what are some of the good buyers doing? Well, the good buyers are the ones that focus down here on process improvement. I know some of you are involved in that, in actually focusing supplier factories and how to get better process improvement. And we know all the stories about what happened to suppliers in the past, where they go and copy. Some of them still do. A lot of them still do. Outsourcing, cheaper labour. We know all these practices, but understand where they come from. They come from all of these pressures. The training costs, product development, market pressure, margins, and monitoring. So when I talk to buyers, I say, well, okay, you've got to get the supplier's mind off these pressures and go straight down to here, process improvement. And you've got to focus on here, and you've got to be on the ground. You need to be watching and actually be involved in this process improvement. Other examples out there, you know, like Colesmeyer from Australia, they're implementing a full ERP system with their 30 suppliers outside of Shanghai for the supply of ladies and babies' clothes. And a full ERP system, they're all involved. Why? Because they want to bring down the product development life cycle from 80 days down to 40 days. And that was critical for them, so they had to go on the ground in Shanghai and working with their suppliers, full ERP systems in place. So they're working with them in here. That's an example of what buyers have to do these days, have to be on the ground. So there is one. Some of you know of this story here. You know the Cherry QQ, it's around Guangzhou. And so my friend at Volkswagen in Shanghai, they grabbed hold of this car, took it back and pulled it apart to find out how can this be made for less than 2/3 the cost of that. And then they found out that the axle in here has the same tooling stamp as the axle of the Chevrolet Spark. So the supplier here or the Cherry QQ manufacturer goes to the same supplier and say, oh, you're doing a run of 100,000 for this car, how about you do 10,000 more, we pay you marginal costs. So we know these games, put your hand up if you understand this game that goes on. Okay, you know these games are going on, so awareness of the games is important to just get change happening, okay? And so often, if you're aware as a buyer, many of you are aware of this, you bring it to the table of your discussions with the supplier. Look, we realise you might have to do this, you're under cost pressure. Okay, let me help you. If you have to actually outsource, then we want to have an audit, third-party audit of that outsourced factory. We want to be with you along the way, all right? We understand you're under cost pressure. So you bring that into the negotiation, conversation. Okay, let's get on. This is something I've just developed lately that talk about structure, relationship, negotiation, due diligence, legal documentation. Many of you are aware of that, measurement and verification. That's a talk for another time. But that's basically everything that is involved with supply management in China. Let's get to this 1,000 study. 2011, wow, that's 4 years ago. Yeah, well, I'm a professor, I'm allowed to have out-of-date data, right? No, not anymore. I don't believe in professors that do that, but a lot of my colleagues do. All right, but 2011, cost control, #1 challenge. There was the questions that we asked in this 1,000 interviews went for 10 pages. There was 10 pages of questions. There were over 100 questions. It wasn't just a one-page tablet with a tablet, iPhone tablet, tick, 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 okay, next. Every interview lasted over 1 hour, okay? And so at the end of that interview, we asked 2 big open-ended questions. What is your #1 challenge? How did you respond to it? Okay, 2011, cost control, competition, sales growth, HR productivity. Very interesting. Oh, touchscreen manufacturer. Wow, November 2011, we're talking to them. Wow, you're doing touchscreens, isn't that amazing? How long have you been doing this for? 3 months. Wow, what were you doing before that? We were making car seat mats. How did you do that? How did you change? Well, we had a good relationship with this customer, this mobile phone manufacturer in China, brand name manufacturer in China, you all know about it if I mentioned it. And this they had a good relationship. They saw that this manufacturer was having a need for this product, so they went and set up all the machinery and said, okay, we're going to do 30,000 units for you. If we set up all the machinery, can you do this? Yes, just go ahead and do it. So the relationship first, that cemented the opportunity, and then investment second. Okay, and that is totally opposite to the Western market knowledge that's put out there. That is, make the product and then market the hell out of it, even though it may not work properly. Just get the first version out there, all right? We know a lot of companies still do that today. The China mentality is see the opportunity, even though that's not your core competency, then you just, okay, what do I have to do to make this opportunity happen? And that's a great example from this touchscreen manufacturing. You think, it's quite high-end compared to a lot of the Chinese manufacturing that's going on. By the way, the 1,000 suppliers, they were all in electronic components industry. So, you would expect that they would be pretty well set up, well endowed in terms of quality control, cost management, and things like that. But that is not always the case. Let's just keep moving. Okay, so in response to cost control, what are most of the suppliers doing? 18% are order. This is of that small sample that said cost control is number one challenge. 18% are automating, the others production efficiency R&D. Notice 18 plus 8 plus 8. Okay, 34%. One third of those that are facing cost control as their number one challenge are responding in a very proactive way. I don't see the first one, the third and the fourth as proactive challenges. You're not changing how you do something. This is where cost control occurs. Only 1/3 that see cost control as a number one challenge is responding in a proactive way. That's what I want you to take away from that. Next, what about response to competition? All right, R&D, 21%. Improvement quality, 8%. Wow, finally, after 30 years in China, this invisible hand is starting to show up. All right, because you always had to impose quality control over factories, and now competition is starting to say, okay, factories realise that they have to improve quality in response to competition. That's your ideal. I know that's not the case for majority of factories in China. We know that because many of the services in front of me wouldn't be in business if that was the case. So let's keep moving on here and what some of these trends are. Let's move on. I want to split through to, here's another idea. I took out, here's the components, here are the suppliers that are in Eastern Seaboard, here are the suppliers that are inland. Guess what? Number one challenge, cost control, competition. Go inland, competition. Over here, 1.46% compared to over 14% here. This is what a lot of people don't realise, or many of you probably do. When you go inland, there's no competition. So if you're a buyer, you don't have alternatives. As a buyer, you don't have that invisible hand working for you. On the Eastern Seaboard, you may pay more, but you have more alternatives. You can move, you have more flexibility. There's all these things that when I talk to buyers that you have as your benefit, don't just think of costs as a reason for locating inland and not staying on the Eastern Seaboard. Okay, let's move to April 2014. I'm now no longer the traditional professor because I have more up-to-date data, even though China's in dog years, so this is nearly 7 years ago. Let's have a look at China Supply 1000. Electronic components 2014. What was your number one challenge? This was April 2014, 98 suppliers, competition, cost control, HR, productivity. All right, so let's, what about response to competition? Most of them were product differentiation, improve the service, advertising, promotion. Improving quality is still in there. It's a small percentage, so it's still not as big as what we want. The theme of today is all about quality and cost control. Competition is supposed to be our friend, but my interviewees don't see competition as forcing them. Oh, I need to react by improving cost, managing my cost better, or improving quality. That's what I'm getting from these frameworks. Now, let's go to one more. 2014 Trade Expo interviews. This is more interesting because up until October 2014, I only interviewed the component suppliers, so B2B, right? And you expect they would have their act in order, right? Because they're directly being told directly from their customer, you should do this, this and this, right? B2C, you would think, okay, maybe they can get a product out there that's not working and no one's going to complain, right? Directly, right? B2B, you get those complaints back directly. Well, let's have a look at B2C. This is automotive consumer electronics. So in dashboard, radios, Bluetooth, the rear view mirror videos, every car's got those videos now. So we had car multimedia, earphone, car accessories, GPS, connectors, power banks. Number one, challenge, competition, then product quality, cost control. Interesting, up until now, product quality was never a challenge. It was never a challenge in the mind of component suppliers. Now I go and talk to B2C, suddenly, wow, quality is a challenge. And maybe that's the mindset that we want to get in Chinese factories, where they don't just see quality as a response, but they see this is a challenge. We need to work at this. Like, it's not a response to a complaint that we're getting. We just need to make it the response period. And that's what this is saying. Like, in the previous graphs, you've got the graphs in front of you, quality, improving quality was always a response, right? Now we go to B2C, look, it's a challenge. That's a good mindset to have. If you know that quality is a challenge, maybe that the consumer market is telling these factories something that the B2B market is not telling the component suppliers. So that's what I got out of some of that. Another thing too, those who had customer base, mainland competition, productivity, but if they overseas customer, the big challenges is competition and cost control. Interesting. Cost control is coming from overseas customers. Excellent here. All right, let's just skip on. Those of you who get bored with electronics, maybe it's because of my ego or something like that, but I've got fashion. I went to a fashion expo. All right. And we did the same thing. 78 Chinese suppliers, accessories, handbags, shoe. All right, number one challenge, competition, market development, cost control. Interesting. Market development is very big as a challenge. Okay, so maybe it's not as sustainable as electronics because fashion changes so very, very quickly. What's fashionable today may not be in 3 months' time. But the responses are very interesting. Increasing management efficiency in response to competition. All right, attending exhibition response to market development. What about cost control? Improving quality. That's an interesting response. R&D, decision making. So basically what I'm trying to do now, like, this is just a small part of the 1,000 interviews that it led to. I'm thinking about, okay, I can get more information, quick and updated information by asking these two questions. What's your number one challenge? How are you responding to it? So next month we're going to Trade Expo again. I'm going to have a team of over 20 interviewers and we're going to go to 5 different segments. And so we're going to ask those same questions. And part of what I'm doing is trying to develop a supplier innovation index, so a way in which we can try to map the extent to which suppliers are innovating. In other words, changing or becoming world class. As I said earlier, there are 4 types of suppliers. There's only one of those types that look to become world class. The others, based on talking to what buyers are doing, this is the second part of the session, about 8 or 9 minutes to go. All right, and I'm thinking, okay, when I talk to buyers around China, so many stories. I talked to one buyer, oh, we're moving out of Guangzhou, we're going to Thailand. Why? Oh, 3 reasons. Okay, labour costs. All right, the other one was IP protection. The other one was the table was too high. You know what I mean there? Table, under the table money, etc. Right? So go down to Bangkok. In 6 months, the Bangkok government put the minimum wage up by 50%. Okay, so I speak to the CEO of this. It's an electric adapter. So you go to any country, plug your power into the socket, right? Very famous European brand. I talked to him 12 months later, and he said, "Well, you know what happened?" He told me about labour costs going up. I said, "What else are you doing to make things better? What are the things you're doing for cost control?" He said, "Well, we're trying to replace screws with clips." to simplify the actual production process. Because when we have screws, then you can screw it in too hard or too soft, but with a clip you have that same tension all the time. Not only that, it's faster to actually put it into the process. So really interesting what you learn from buyers. There was another buyer I spoke to, they moved from Guangzhou to Shanghai. Why did you move to Shanghai? I thought Shanghai was more expensive. Well, it's a dictum from Germany head office because they want more clarity and transparency in the documentation of all transactions. And that does not happen in Guangzhou, but it's more likely to happen in Shanghai. And even though it's more expensive in Shanghai, and this was a German electronics manufacturer that made transformers. Okay, they had a joint venture in Guangzhou, so they knew what the situation was like, and then they put in their next investment was a woofie, and so they decided, no, that woofie goes in Shanghai. The German office just decided, yes, for transparency reasons, we need it in Shanghai, whatever the cost. So I've got a lot of stories that explain, oh, why did someone go inland? Why did someone go from inland back to the eastern seaboard? Okay, why did someone move down out of China? Why did someone move into China? All these stories here. Let me take you back to the end of today's talk. Here are the major cell phone manufacturers. I asked two questions. What do you focus on when you're selecting suppliers? Okay, these are leading smartphone manufacturers. This is about 3 or 4 years ago. Okay, so you know who they are because most of them are around today. And so technology was very, very big. Bang, bang, bang in the selection. It wasn't about cost at all. Okay, but what about when it came to the purchasing order decision? Purchasing order decision, technology for this one, but quality, and for this last one was delivery. Still, cost did not figure in the purchasing order decision again. They were really focused on delivery, quality, and matching the technology roadmap that the supplier has with the technology roadmap that the buyer has. It was all about the capability. And so maybe you say, oh, this is a bit too high end for the average Chinese supplier, but here is basically what I learned that will actually fit into today's theme from these major buyers. And these are all smartphone leading brands in the world. They audit many suppliers. Many of you know about this. Cost leadership measure, specialist purchasing managers, cost down. Very interesting. I had one purchasing manager come in, and he actually did backwards engineering, 20 minutes of a smartphone case to work out how much the supplier's tooling would cost to make that case. I said, wow, how can you do that? He said, oh, because I worked for ASA for 15 years before working for this company, and he had a background in engineering. I'm thinking, I tell my accounting students, you need a double major, not accounting and finance, it should be accounting and engineering. All right, and you'll be so much more valuable because you can speak to everyone in the organisation. You can outsource finance, you can't always outsource engineering without losing protection of your IP. So we have buyer power and information sharing. I talked to one smartphone manufacturer. They had the Korean TFT delivery suppliers and Japanese TFT suppliers as the touchscreen. And so I spoke to one. I said, oh, is there anything that your suppliers don't tell you that you'd like to know? And they said, yes, it would be the yield. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, all right. So which of your suppliers can you get that information from? Oh, we can always get it from the Chinese suppliers, but the Korean, Japanese won't tell us. Oh, that's interesting. More power, right? Okay, and this was a Taiwanese manufacturer. So I went to this other smartphone manufacturer, and I said, is there anything the suppliers don't tell you you'd like to know? And I said, no, we know everything. I said, oh, how do you know? Oh, because we have the power. And I'm thinking, well, come on, give us the detail. How do you find out? How can you find out the yield if they don't tell you? Oh, because we dictate the inputs to those suppliers. We tell where they need to purchase the materials. So we know the inputs, we know the outputs, so we can do the yields. Okay. Now these smartphone manufacturers are so industrious in order to protect their reputation from social responsibility and things like that. They would actually buy the machine and put it in the supplier's factory. And then they have an agreement with the supplier. Okay, you get to use this machine, you get to use 40% of this machine for the next 3 years. We have 60% control over the capacity, and then you keep the machine after 3 years. And that's how some of these leading brands around the world protect themselves from these other environmental requirements by stakeholders. Anyway, let me just finish there. I want to give you some real life stories, not just some professorial thinking about frameworks, but I really, this is what I learned from the buyers, talking to the buyers. What I learned from talking to the suppliers was that, wow, every supplier is different. And if there's one thing I learned from the supplier is, and I spoke to so many of them, and what I learned was, is there one thing that distinguishes a good supplier from a bad supplier? Is there one thing? Is there a silver bullet? Put your hand up if you think there's a silver bullet. Anyone? We can discuss this later, but there's one silver bullet that came out very, very clear in talking to the suppliers, and that is the mentality of the owner. It wasn't the machine, it wasn't the factory, it wasn't what you saw when you looked down. Of course, that gave you clues, right? And we all see that, but it's the mentality of the owner. Does that owner have a world-class manufacturing mentality, or as the interview, as my friend from Apple was telling me, that they get many suppliers coming to them wanting to be approved supplier. Is the owner someone that just wants to get approved? They wants to get approved, and then they use that approved. Oh, I'm an approved supplier for Apple. Oh, you can buy from me. They go to the other customers and use that for marketing. Then they get profits from other customers. Then they use the profits to get an IPO, and then they use the IPO to buy property. And that was the other mentality that we saw out there, right? So from the supplier point of view, the silver bullet is the mentality of the owner. Do they have this, okay, I want my property? Or is the owner someone like the major Chinese car manufacturer? Who's that? It's a trick question. BYD, right? Because you know BYD, 12 years ago, they failed 3 times with Motorola to actually become an approved supplier. And then on the final time, Motorola approved them. And now the rest is history, because now they're making world-class stuff, because Motorola taught them those procedures so many years ago. And how did they sustain to become the best today? It was the mentality of the owner. It's the owner's mentality. So let me wrap it up.